there, Booksy, welcome back to my channel and welcome to A Closer Book. This is a series where I talk about 3 of my recent reads. We are now up to books 64 to 66 in the quest to read 102 books in 2017. Today is a little bit different because usually I have a non-fiction book in the mix to discuss. Today they're all fiction. First up is Rubbing Stones by Nancy Berkey, and I read this book when it was in its galley phase, courtesy of NetGalley. This one is about 2 families that have teenage sons in trouble. One family is American, the other family is African from Botswana, and they meet in Zimbabwe. So the first family is the American family. We meet them when this teenage boy winds up in jail. His father is a politician, his mother is a psychiatry professor, and they both agree that they want their son to be rehabilitated. They don't want him to go down this criminal path. So the mother decides that they're going to take this African safari trip and eventually go on to volunteer, do some community service in Botswana. So they leave for this safari trip to spend some time for the family to reconnect before they go on to their community service, which she hopes will help rehabilitate her son. Then we meet Katura and her brother. They are living in Botswana, but they just found out that their elder brother is in prison in Zimbabwe. He left to go work in Zimbabwe with some relatives, but he's gotten arrested because of some political corruption, and so they decide to cross the border into Zimbabwe to try to work on getting him released. In the process of working on their brother's release, they meet up with their brother's friends and another relative, and so they have some encounters with this family on the safari trip along the river. And that is where the bulk of the story takes place. As the safari trip goes south, there is some kidnapping, there is some terrorism, there is some political drama happening, and we get to see these 2 families' lives intersect. What I liked about the book, I found the conversation to be pretty interesting. I appreciated seeing female characters in both villain and heroic roles. And the alternating views by which the author told the story gave a really good narrative, so you're able to see the whole story play out. However, the story was not well told in general. There was a lot of focus on a backstory for these characters, and events that were discussed in the beginning of the book had nothing to do with the plot as it moved forward. The setting of the story was a little ambiguous, and for a lot of the time I wasn't sure whether the novel was supposed to be happening in Botswana or in Zimbabwe, because first we meet this American family who their plan is to go to Botswana. Then we meet a family who are already in Botswana, and yet the story doesn't happen in Botswana, it happens in Zimbabwe. So it kind of felt like the author wanted to talk about Botswana but then realized that she couldn't. And the transition from one country to another, I think, was a little bit confusing, especially if you're not familiar with the differences between the 2 political climates like I was. I felt like because the book was aimed at a woman's audience, the author tried to portray women as really heroic and strong, but in doing so, it felt like she had to dampen the male characters. So a lot of the male characters were portrayed as pretty thoughtless and weak, and in every situation it seemed like only the women had the plans, only the women were leaders. And I don't feel like that is necessary for women's fiction. I don't feel like you have to downplay the role of men in order to elevate women. Because women were strong enough on our own, like we don't have to pull men down in order for us to shine. It was also very hard to visualize the characters as they were stated. The maturity level of teenagers is very different as we move from one culture to another. When we first meet Katura, she is the annoying baby sister in a very juvenile role, and then the next time we see her, she's being cast as a seductress who is now appealing to this other teenager from another country. And so it was very hard to put a finger on how old she was supposed to be. The long introduction that the author created also was very confusing. There were a lot of things that were brought out, a lot of backstory that was mentioned that didn't seem necessary to the story. When we first meet the main American woman, we first meet her in her class and we meet a lot of her students, but they don't appear in the rest of the novel. So that didn't feel like it was very well done. I also don't appreciate when an author kills characters for no apparent reason, and in this one there were a lot of murders that did nothing to advance the plot. Overall though, the author did keep me interested enough to keep reading. This is a story that would benefit from some good editing. I'm not sure what the finished version looks like, and I know it is available now in Kindle and I think paperback format. So if you've read it, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. Then I read We're All Completely Beside Ourselves by Karen Joy Fowler, another Karen. In the prologue of this one, the narrator, Rosemary, she says that she was a chatterbox as a child. No surprise there, because most of us, I think, were chatterboxes when we were children. So she immediately makes a connection between the narrator and the reader. But what she doesn't give you is details about her childhood, only to say that her sister has disappeared, her brother is no longer present, and she alone is left to talk about her childhood. So you realize that the story she's going to tell is going to be a very biased story. It isn't until page 77, I think, where she tells you the real absurdity of her childhood. And because I don't want to spoil this book for you if you haven't read it, I won't tell you what the absurdity is, except to say that there are parts of Rosemary's story that will remind you of the story of Tarzan, who she does say is her favorite superhero, and the story of Jane Goodall, who chose the life that Rosemary inherits, and maybe even a little bit about Ross, who had a pet monkey in the first season of Friends. So we learned that Rosemary was raised as a kind of lab experiment, poked and prodded, and the results recorded, and her behavior charted and analyzed instead of just lived. And so this is the kind of book where when you've finished, you kind of want to reread it to see how you missed the clues that she had been feeding you all along. So Rosemary splits her name, and so she creates Rose and her alter ego Mary, who are both characters that you kind of want to pet and stroke because you can't undo the things that have been done to them. But aside from empathy, I alternated between liking and not really liking at all Rosemary's character. Rosemary cannot change her childhood, but she chooses her reality by either revealing or framing her past in such clever ways that you're not sure until she tells you what her role is in her childhood. And so you're left to wonder, is Rosemary a villain or a victim? And how much of Rose's constructed memories will be refuted by either the diaries that her mother has left her or the scholarly journals that were written about her childhood? Fowler makes this novel very scholarly. She uses language that is pretty pedantic, pretty scientific, in such a way that it will appeal to readers who love science, readers who love science in fiction, not necessarily science fiction. But I think that she only does this to show that Rosemary is a character who has spent her life proving herself. Like, she feels like she has to use language like this to make you think that she is smarter than she probably thinks of herself. This is the kind of novel that is sufficiently complex to be interesting and sensitive if you understand the references that Rosemary is making, but if you don't, then it might not be worth your time. So throughout the novel, literary and scientific and cultural references just pop up, and we're not really told where they came from or how they apply to the story, just that they're there. And they would either enlighten or confuse you depending on what your background is. So it felt at several times like the reader had to prove themselves worthy in order to read this book. So I'll give you an example. On page 139, and this is where I had my little bookmark, and this paragraph pops up without any connection. When a portent repeats itself 3 times, like something out of Julius Caesar, even Caliban, a couple of plays over, is bound to notice. Do you know who Caliban is? Caliban is a character from The Tempest, who I only know because I just read Margaret Atwood's adaptation of The Tempest. But without having that prior knowledge, would I have gotten that reference and would I understand what she was saying? Writing was exquisite, the characters and plots were sufficiently complex, and the idea was a truly novel one. However, there were parts where the reporting droned on. I felt like the author's treatment of one of the major characters was not resolved at the end of the novel, so ultimately I struggled on how to give it a rating, but I think eventually I settled on something like 4 out of 5 stars. And then we come to The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime by Mark Haddon. The main character in this one is Christopher Boone. He is 15 years, 3 months, and a few days old when we meet him, and he is investigating the murder of his neighbor's dog. He's a mathematical savant and he attends a special school for children who have some form of mental disability. The things where he struggles on usually are social things, but he is really good at numbers, of course. His inability to deal with social situations makes for a very comical read as he describes his day-to-day events, and it's through his reporting that we learn a lot of the things about his life at home. I like the novelty of the book. It's written kind of like a documentary or a lab report to characterize a savant narrator with a scientific bent. I think the author did a really good job of imprinting Christopher's fanaticism of numerology all over the book. Like, the pages are not numbered in numerical order, they're ordered in prime numbers. I thought that that was a cute little addition. However, the narrative wanders as it follows Christopher's imaginative mind. The things that he notices and talks about kind of vacillates on boring and uninteresting at times. As Christopher does not process emotion, the narrative comes off as very emotionally removed and distant. Christopher himself comes off as very unlikable, while the supporting characters that he mentioned just really get your empathy because they're dealing with his disorder. I gave Curious Incident a high rating because even though I think this kind of story has been told several times since this novel was published and probably told better, I give this high ratings because at the time when it was written, it was probably a new idea. So these are books 64 to 66. Join me for my next episode of A Closer Book, where I'll talk about 3 more recent reads. Thanks for watching this video. Please leave me a comment down below if you've read these books and want to chat about them. Thanks again for watching. See you in the comments, and until next time, happy reading. Bye!